Welcome. My name is Charles Stone. I have the honor of serving as the mayor of the city of Belmont this year, and also of continuing my service on the San Mateo County Libraries Governing Board as a governing board member. I'm so happy so many of you have tuned in this evening to hear this talk with author Talia Lavin. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. Your microphone and video will be turned off for the webinar. We'll start with a reading from Talia from her book, Culture Warlords, followed by an interview, then lastly with questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. That's how we're going to take them. And the Q&A button is found at the bottom of the screen. For those of you who'd like to access live closed captions for this event, click on the CC icon in your Zoom toolbar and then click on Show Subtitle. Now, as they used to say, on to the show. San Mateo County Libraries is excited to host Talia Lavin, author of Culture Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. Utilizing various aliases, Talia infiltrated online hate groups and revealed their inner workings to the world in a startling portrait of modern intolerance. This author talk is a part of our Between the Lines literary programming series. Talia is a Harvard University alum and freelance writer who has had bylines in the New Yorker, the New Republic, the Washington Post, and more. Culture Warlords is the editor's choice for the New York Times Book Review and is listed as a must-read by Time Magazine, the New York Times, and USA Today. Welcome, Talia.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here but speaking to San Mateo County, and really excited to speak to a mayor. So I debated which passage to read from the book, but I thought the introduction would be a fitting introduction and also kind of a good introduction. I keep saying that word. A good overview of some of the themes in the book and what the prose is like. And I assume being here on a weeknight on a library program, you guys are avid readers. So I really appreciate you guys coming out or staying in anyway. So this is the introduction. There's a classic New Yorker cartoon that I like. From the early days of the internet, 1993. And it features a pooch sitting in an office chair at a blocky Mac-looking computer, talking to another dog who's looking up at him, bemused. The caption: on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Well, that may be true, but on the internet, nobody knows you're a Jew either, unless you announce it. And while writing this book for the first time in my life, I spent a whole lot of time, a full year, not telling people I was a Jew, and listening to what they said when I didn't. In order to look as deeply as I could into the world of white nationalism, I had to leave my own identity behind as often as not. In real life, I'm a schlubby, bisexual Jew living in Brooklyn with long, brown, ratty curls, the matronly figure of a mother in a Philip Roth novel, and the brassy personal politics that aren't particularly sectarian, but fall considerably to the left of Medicare for all. Over the course of writing this book, I had to leave my own skin. And sometimes what I found made me want to never return to it. Here are a few things I did over the course of working on this book. I fabricated, a lot, spectacularly. I invented identities from whole cloth, purely because I needed to enter communities where my real self, Jewish, a journalist, a well-known fascism-hating Twitter loudmouth, was extremely unwelcome. And so I had to become other people and invent them as I went along. I pretended to be a slender, petite, blonde huntress who'd grown up on a white nationalist compound in Iowa, looking for suitors on a whites-only dating site. I pretended to be a down-and-out warehouse worker in Morgantown, West Virginia, who had become suicidal after his wife left him, only to be restored to his full self by becoming part of the white nationalist movement and willing to do anything to support his brothers in the cause. I pretended to be an incel, an involuntarily celibate virgin, radicalized into a deep hatred of women by his lack of sexual success. I infiltrated a Europe-based neo-Nazi terror propaganda cell called the Vorherrschaft Division by pretending to be a sexy young woman with an interest in saving the white race through violence, with the screen name Aryan Queen. I silently observed as neo-Nazis mused about what raping me would be like, and as myself, I went to dark places. I spoke to bad people and good people on the front lines of the battle for America. As myself, I attended a conference for alt-right YouTubers in Philadelphia and was chased out of a casino. I spoke to everyday anti-fascists defending their community in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was rejected from joining a white supremacist pagan ritual in the Albany area by the elders of a weightlifting pagan cult called Operation Werewolf. I listened to a terrible white nationalist freestyle rap diss battle. I watched neo-Nazis post photos of trans children and Jewish children and Black children and talk about killing them. Every day for nearly a year, I immersed myself in chat groups and websites and forums where photos of lynchings were passed around like funny memes, where "Kill Jews" was a slogan and murderers were called saints. On the anniversary of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, I watched them celebrate Robert Bowers, the murderer of 11 Jews at prayer, like a hero and a friend. I listened to strangers talk about killing kikes every day. I listened to strangers incite violence and praise murder, and talking about washing the world with blood to make it white and pure. I listened to their podcasts, I watched their videos. I listened to their terrible music and watched them plan to meet and celebrate the racism that was their raison d'etre. And something snapped in me. I admit it, I started this book angry at the racist right. I set out with the idea of writing a profane but intellectual, impassioned but clear book to spell out just exactly who these people are and what they want to do. Before I started writing, I was already the top Google search result for greasy fat kike, thanks to neo-Nazi website The Daily Stormer. A hate group called Patriot Front had already sent my parents a postcard with the Nazi-era slogan, "Blood and Soil." I had already had my relatives' names published on Gab, a white supremacist-friendly social media site used by alleged Pittsburgh synagogue shooter Robert Bowers. I thought I was ready for what researching this book would do to me. I wasn't. As I write this now, I feel myself incandescent with the kind of anger that doesn't just last an evening. It's an old cliche that lovers shouldn't go to bed angry. Well, for the past year, I have gone to bed with my anger and woken up with my anger, and gone about with my day with my anger hot and wet like blood in my mouth. It's not that I discovered that members of the racist far right are inhuman or monsters beyond comprehension. They're not some entirely new species of being that requires forensic analysis and the dispassionate gaze of the scientist. They're not uniquely stupid or uniquely mired in poverty or uniquely beset by social problems or even members of any specific socioeconomic class. They're not monsters, they're people. Just people, mostly men and some women, all over this country and this world, who have chosen to hate, to base the meanings of their lives on hate, to base their communities of solidarity on hate, to cultivate their hate with tender, daily attention. They are just people. People with an entire alternate curriculum of history, who operate within an insular world of propaganda built to stoke rage and incite killings, and for no other purpose at all. There are rich men and poor men, tradesmen and office workers, teenagers and men cresting middle age. They eat and sleep and sometimes drink too much and sometimes are sober. They're lonely, some of them, horny, some of them, sometimes depressed and sometimes confused and sometimes joyful. They're people, just like you and me. They could work in the next cubicle over and you might not know it. Sit one seat over in class from you and you might not know it. Live in your neighborhood, play on your sports team, and you would never know that deep in the night they trade photos of lynchings like baseball cards and laugh. But I know them now, these men and women. I've seen what they write and how they talk and what they read and even how they sing, poorly. It's precisely their humanity that angers me so much. The hate they promulgate and the violence they desire are the culmination of dozens or hundreds of small human choices. They choose every day and every day more of them to create alternate identities that embrace the swastika and the skull mask and the Totenkopf, the worst of history and the worst of the present melding seamlessly. They choose to dream not of peace or of equality, or of anything better than the sorry, ragged world as it is, but of a worse world, riven by terror, awash in the blood of those they consider subhuman, which means anyone not white, which means anybody Jewish, which means anyone who fights back against their putrid cancer of an ideology. Their dialogue is unremittingly puerile and violent. Everything about them goes back again and again to violence, as a hummingbird to nectar. It is what they crave. It fills them with a fleeting sense of virility and meaning. The fear they can instill makes them feel powerful. The murderers they celebrate are their brothers in arms. And I admit that as I researched this book and wrote it, the anger I felt calcified into a parallel hatred, one based not on skin color, but on the sheer accumulation of vitriol I consumed, and the way people I'd never met spoke about killing people who looked just like my nieces and nephews, my cousin and aunts, my lovers, my friends, me. In a sense, I began to enjoy deceiving them, taking an awkward pleasure in my own duplicity. But anger at these bigots was only part of what I felt. Some of my rage became directed at people who opposed strong action against neo-Nazi organizing. I raged against white moderates, the people who don't believe in deplatforming Nazis from every perch they get, or facing down their marches, depriving them of audience and influence and a safe pedestal from which to spread their bile. The people who say, ignore them, let them march, let them tweet, let them speak on campus, let them have their say, and they will be defeated in the marketplace of ideas. The people who bill themselves as reasonable, who say, let them air out their arguments. But the effect of these ideas when they are aired out is much like Zyklon B. Studying them as deeply as I have has made me realize no amount of such rhetoric is acceptable in the country's discourse, just as there is no acceptable amount of poisonous gas to let seep into a room. To assert otherwise is an argument born of self-congratulation. The argument that being tolerant of violent racism is just another form of tolerance, and not a capitulation to the far right's own view of their legitimacy. There are different strains of racist far-right ideas that I will discuss in the book. Okay, sorry. I'm just gonna skip a paragraph or two. There's racism bound up in religious ideas, racism bound up in pseudoscience, and all of it is poison. And to allow any of it to be aired, particularly under the mealy-mouthed argument for tolerance, is to give way to a movement that seeks absolute power and the total destruction of its enemies, who are its enemies by virtue of the immutable characteristics of their birth. The more I grew to know this movement, the less patience I had for it, and still less for those who tolerate it. Studying the far right taught me what it means to have an enemy to whom one must give no quarter, because any ground given allows them to accrue power, and any increment of power they receive they will use towards violent ends. Over the course of the research that I did for this book, and the gonzo journalism come activism it entailed, I became radicalized. The violent far right has the sole goal of destruction, and allowing them to amass any power at all is to accede to that goal. To make peace with white supremacy, to give it room, to tender it mercy, is to assert that protecting Black and brown and Muslim and gay and trans and Jewish people from violence isn't all that important or necessary. The marketplace of ideas breaks down when poison is sold in pretty packages, when hate is pressed into eager hands. Studying the far right taught me what hatred looks like, and taught me how to hate. Hatred makes me itch inside. It's like wearing a too small wool sweater over my soul. It doesn't come naturally to me, although anger does. It's painful to have your face pressed up for so long against the intellectual equivalent of aqua regia. I can feel my soul deformed, distended. It will hurt for a long time. But I know why I've done this, and it's hardly for money or fame. There are easier routes to both. For those children they want to kill, for my baby relatives, my cousins and aunts, my lovers, my friends, and me. The poet Ilya Kaminsky describes the responsibility of being an author in his poem, Author's Prayer. I must walk on the edge of myself. I must live as a blind man who runs through rooms without touching the furniture. For a year, to write this book, I lived at the very edge of myself and beyond it. I became unrecognizable to myself. I lived in the world of hate and only from time to time emerged into a world that had love in it and good cheese and olives and my apartment in Brooklyn and the novels of Terry Pratchett and everything worth living for. My mind spun hellward for months, but I did these things to describe these people, white supremacists, and their culture and their motivations. To do so is to deprive them of the power to organize in total darkness, to operate as the terrifying boogeyman they would so like to be. It is to drag them by their hair into the light and let them scream. This is not a comprehensive accounting of the far right and its history, nor even a full picture of the far right's contemporary presence online. There are many areas I was not able to penetrate fully, from far-right women's groups, who are more elusive than their male counterparts, to the sprawling anti-government militia movement that organizes primarily on Facebook, which overlaps significantly, though not perfectly, with white supremacist groups. This is an accounting of a sliver of a movement at a moment in time, a world I moved through as though it were a room whose walls were made of burning glass. I learned a lot, though there is always more to learn, and I learned what I cannot forgive. I will never forgive them for hating me and everyone I love as much as they do. I have friends neo-Nazis who publicly fantasized about raping and flaying and murdering and leaving for dead, and I will never forget that. I will never forgive them for making me hate them as much as I do, for folding a red loathing into my soul. So let Culture Warlords, such as it is, be part revenge, part explainer, and partly the story of what hate does to those who observe it and those who manufacture it. Let it be a manual that leads you to fight for a better world, for you, for me, for all the Black kids and Muslim kids and Jewish kids and trans kids and brown kids. Deserve a world free of the verminous miasma of hatred. Let us hold it to the light, this wet, rotting, malodorous thing, and let it dry up and crumble into dust and be gone.
Talia, thank you. That was very powerful, just like the book was.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll give you a second there, and then we're gonna start the Q&A. And I'll remind folks that if you have questions from the audience, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and our staff will assemble them into a document and make sure I ask them if there's time. So Talia, first off, how did you go about, what was your reasoning in coming up with the various identities that you used to infiltrate these communities? You had quite a few online personas, and obviously you couldn't go in as yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I should say I didn't set out to write this as like a gonzo book, you know? I am not quite like Hunter S. Talia, you know what I mean? Like my goal wasn't necessarily to do all this undercover stuff initially, but as I sort of said, like just my reputation preceded me. My faith, you know, or ethnicity or whatever you want to call it, being a Jew, precluded me from speaking to a lot of these groups. And there were, you know, lots of instances where I reached out and, you know, as myself and tried to sort of go the more straightforward journalistic route and elicit a spokesperson's comment and this and that, and just found myself completely turned away or greeted with, you know, extraordinary vitriol or, you know, just unusable commentary. So I wound up creating these personas not out of sort of an initial desire to go gonzo, but because I was sort of forced into it. I may have then embraced it with some gusto and wound up juggling, you know, sometimes 5 or 6 personas in a day. And one of them was me, and I had to figure out which, you know, how to live that way. But, you know, I do think there are some advantages to that sort of thing. You know, spokespeople tend to speak in a more polished way. They want to present their movement in the most favorable light. Whereas if you're observing the rank and file sort of at close quarters where they think they're not necessarily being observed, I think you get a truer sense of, you know, what the rhetoric of a movement is like. And, you know, you get a more unvarnished privileged view.
I can only imagine how difficult it had to be to juggle all of those and remember which room was which personality. It's impressive. This is a good question, I think, and I'm curious to hear your answer. What was the hardest part of this whole process for you?
It's hard to pick out. And this is my first book, and I think there's an old truism that everyone's first book is part autobiography. And I think I put a lot of myself on the page in ways that now I'm almost like, oh, I got like so personal about what writing this was like. But I think there were definitely like days that were harder than others, moments when I felt like physically in danger, just like, which was mainly at like an alt-right conference in Philadelphia. Like that was very unnerving, or like moments when, the moment at the opening of chapter 1 where I was like in a very violent neo-Nazi chat room and found they were discussing, like not knowing I was there, what raping me would be like. Like that was quite a day. But overall, I think it was sort of a cumulative sense of just like waking up every morning and checking these, I still have on my phone, I'm still like in, somewhere between 90 and 120 like hate chat rooms. And, waking up and checking Holocaust 2 or Expose the Nose or, whatever, like lots of chat rooms full of racial slurs, and spending all day surfing this stuff and, checking it right before I went to sleep. I mean, it just made you feel like you were in this bell jar, like cut off from the world. Cumulatively, it was very corrosive. And so now I'm still writing about the far right, but the immersion is a bit less extreme, and like I try to pace myself a little bit more.
Well, that leads me to my next question very nicely, which is, you spent so much time on this, you steeped yourself in it, you were in these chat rooms hearing awful things. Little did you know, at least once, they would be awful things about you directly. So on a personal level, this had to take a tremendous emotional toll. And how did you deal with that? And what kind of steps did you take to kind of insulate yourself emotionally, if that's even possible?
I think it's very hard to insulate yourself emotionally, but I think the probably the most like solace that I attained, or like the way I was able to get through, was through like camaraderie with especially women who like cover the same beat and had experienced some of the same stuff. I spoke to folks on the beat, and conferred with them regularly. We checked in with each other. We're all sort of broken along the same seams and have the same crazy urges, like driving us to explore this netherworld. And so I think that sense of camaraderie and shared purpose was really like a primary method of solace and an emotional wherewithal and courage throughout the process.
I can only imagine without that support group, it probably would have been impossible. So I'm glad you had that. So the country is grappling with the aftermath of the Atlanta shootings last week. Before we even got our feet underneath us, we're dealing with more shootings this week. But regarding the Atlanta shooting, it seems fair to say that there's been some discomfort from some people linking racial and gender violence. And I'm curious what your take is. Is misogyny an underpinning of fascism and white supremacy? There certainly appears to be an intersection, but do you think misogyny underpins fascism and white supremacy? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly in the book, I talk about the many nexuses of these two movements. I think with regards to that specific crime, I mean, obviously I'm not an investigator on the scene, but I think this sort of question, was it misogyny or was it racism, is sort of to its face a little bit absurd to me. The two are intimately interconnected. Things can be both at the same time. You know, certainly in this case, it seemed like very targeted against, it was specifically Asian-owned businesses. It was specifically Asian women who were primarily targeted. And, you know, this idea that like women of a certain ethnicity can be reduced to an avatar of sexual temptation, as the shooter seemed to say, it, you know, in statements mediated by the authorities, that, you know, he sought to eliminate temptation. I mean, he was eliminating human beings, and actually women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, like, you know, he had a bad day, and sought to literally destroy human lives because they had caused him sexual temptation. I mean, that to me is the nexus of misogyny, of white supremacy, you know, deeply racist assumptions, but also the violence inherent in the movement. Misogyny and white supremacy are intertwined in a lot of ways. Just to speak about a few of them very quickly, you know, misogyny and anti-feminism is a very ambient hatred and bigotry in our culture. It's often used as a hook to draw people deeper into hate. You know, when you have slickly produced anti-feminist content that blames many of the ills that people experience in their lives on feminism and feminists, and creates carte blanche to harass certain feminists, you know, that's a very common tactic to draw people into the far right. Misogyny is an animating principle of the white supremacist worldview. So they see feminism as like a Jewish perversion to reduce the fertility of white people. They see that they very much embrace antiquated gender roles and embrace notions of masculinity, you know, empowered masculinity and chaste, then fertile white femininity. And, you know, they really see violence against uppity women who would seek equality as, you know, a cornerstone of their movement. And that's without even getting into the incel movement, which in and of itself, which I address in a separate chapter as its own faction of the far right, because it is, to my mind, a radicalized misogynist movement.
It certainly is. So we're going to move on to audience questions. And just a reminder, I see several hands raised. Folks, if your hand is raised, we're not going to be calling on you or unmuting you, but if you'd like to go ahead and ask a question, please use the Q&A function, and that is an option you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So again, raised hands aren't going to help you at all in this particular Zoom meeting. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and staff will assemble it into a document and send it to me. So the first question from the audience is, to what extent have you taken precautions for safety after you published this book, and have there been any direct threats on you?
Yeah, well, right after the book was published, I got a lovely visit from a couple of FBI counterterrorism task force agents who were like, hey, there are death and rape threats against you. And I said, what else is new? You know, unfortunately, that is certainly part of the reality. And I do try to take certain security precautions, like scrubbing my contact info and that of my family from, you know, stuff like whitepages.com, you know, these data brokers that put your address online. I actually don't vote at current address that I live in. You know, I vote at an old address because voter records are public. You know, whenever I'm at a place, I won't post photos to social media until several hours after I've left that location. So just stuff like that, you know, it's definitely part of my situational awareness as I go about my day. And unfortunately, a particularly determined white supremacist like posted my parents' address and my mother's office phone number on like a particularly pernicious site for white supremacists, you know, literally just last week, and I called the FBI about it. I mean, it happens as part of my life, and the part that's the most difficult to swallow is like not necessarily danger to me. I mean, I think anyone who engages in this work might have a little bit of a Freudian death wish going on, but it's that like it endangers then my family, you know, and just the people who have the misfortune of loving me, and that's a pretty difficult pill to swallow, just because they didn't do anything wrong except be born Jewish, you know. But that's sort of the logic of how these groups work, that, you know, no one is off limits, especially no one in a disfavored group, you know, a dehumanized group. And so, you know, that's really hard, but I'm very thankful that my parents are very supportive of my work, and they could certainly be a lot more resentful of like me putting them in danger with my book and the stuff I write. And instead they've chosen to be proud of me. And I really, really appreciate that every day.
I noticed that you dedicated the book to them. You had a couple nice lines at the end. And as the father of a daughter, if my daughter, either my daughters ever did anything as courageous as you did and dedicated the book to me, let me tell you, as a parent, that would make me incredibly proud and put me over the moon. So I'm sure that they were very
Well,
touched.
occasionally my mom will be like, "Can't you write about cooking or something? Like, can't you write about something else for your next book? Isn't there like whales, cheese, lots of other stuff?" And I'm like, "Oh, maybe." But the clan, it's so interesting, you know.
Somehow I feel like it wouldn't quite get your fire burning as much. So I had another question I was going to ask you earlier, and I'm glad I waited because a few of the audience members kind of posed similar questions. So you've described yourself as an anti-fascist, and for many people, the only lens or reference point they have for the term anti-fascism is the last president's rhetoric around Antifa. Can you provide a little more context for the contemporary anti-fascist movement and your role in it? I think that might be educational for some folks.
Yeah. So yeah, I think first of all, the book has 2 chapters dedicated to the anti-fascist movement. One about sort of the many media myths around it, and then the second, kind of the closing chapter, about the many anti-fascists I've met, and what anti-fascist work looks like. There's also the wonderful, if you're looking for a book that really gets to the heart of the history of the anti-fascist movement, there's Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray, which I really highly recommend. It's a quick read and a really educational one. But just to sum up really quickly, anti-fascism, you know, is a tradition that maps to the history of fascism. So for as long as there's been fascism throughout the 20th century, there have been anti-fascists who recognized its dangers and fought that out, from the Arditi del Popolo, who, you know, brawled with Mussolini's brown shirts in the streets, to, you know, the German communists and socialists who fought against Hitler's minions. And then in the post-war world, you know, one of the groups that I look to with a lot of fondness and pride is the 1943 group that, you know, was composed of British ex-servicemen who were Jews, who took exception to Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Fascist Party, organizing openly, and said about, you know, sending Mosley's speakers and Confederates along their way, you know, on their way when they gathered, and also, you know, sought by means of sort of propaganda and letting, you know, speaking and trying to persuade venue owners and all sorts of tactics to disrupt British Fascist Party organizing. You know, and of course, the legendary Battle of Cable Street in 1936, which was, you know, the British Fascist Party deliberately sought to march through a Jewish part of town, the East End of London, and were, you know, with police protection, and they were held off by a mob of Jews and communists and people who just didn't have any truck with the Fascist Party. And then in the modern era, you know, in the 80s and 90s, there were ARA, Anti-Racist Action, who were punks, skinhead punks who organized against neo-Nazi skinhead punks. There were brawls in the street, but also flyers and counter flyers and zines, and so Antifa is a word that comes from German. It's short for Antifaschistische Aktion, and that's a term from the 20s, and 30s, but it's been resurrected. It's been used by the German left for a while, a couple decades now, in terms of countering neo-Nazis there. And it was first adopted in the US in 2017, in 2007 rather, by Rose City Antifa, the Portland anti-fascist collective that's still around. And they first formed in opposition to a neo-Nazi skinhead music festival that was being proposed. So that's like a kind of scattered pastoral history, but it goes back a little bit longer than, scary B-roll of people all in Black would have you believe. And it has, nobler intentions. I think of Antifa and anti-fascism in general as a community defense tactic. The infamous Black Bloc, dressing in Black and wearing masks before we all did, is more about, not being identifiable to the fascist groups that people were opposing and to law enforcement officers that all too often treat these groups with kid gloves and, sort of do their bidding in some ways by repressing the left pretty ferociously. And I also want to make clear that, while I believe, and this is my personal belief as an anti-fascist, I believe that there's a very big role, that street action can take, when a far-right march comes to town. Pretty much all anti-fascist action is reactive. It's like, you hear the Proud Boys are coming to town. You hear there's going to be a Klan rally or a neo-Nazi rally in your town, and you walk up and you get ready, because certainly the Proud Boys, their MO is like, go find someone visibly queer or visibly of color and go attack them. So having an organized counter group that says we're putting our bodies on the line to defend our community, there's a place for that. But also there's a lot of other anti-fascist activities that have nothing to do with the street. I'm not a particularly gifted or good street operative. I have a panic disorder and don't like crowds. And so research is a huge element of anti-fascism. It's about figuring out who these people are. It's about infiltrating their chats and finding out their identities and then letting their communities know. It's about doing something as simple as you hear a white nationalist conference is happening, you call up the hotel, where it's taking place, and you say, hey, you're hosting a white nationalist conference, or tagging them on Twitter, shaming the venue, stuff like that. Reporting a neo-Nazi account, that's an anti-fascist action. So it's lots of small stuff. It's a diversity of tactics. And, the best, many anti-fascists have told me that, if you organize well enough online, with these different tactics, you never have to wind up at the street melee, because you stop stuff before it starts. And that's the most effective anti-fascism of all, is making yourself invisible.
Yeah, I was going to follow up and ask you if you thought that the anti-fascist movement needed to be more proactive, because you talk about it being reactive. And while those other things you talked about aren't necessarily proactive, they're more proactive than waiting until it has to go to the streets. And so it sounds like you do.
Yeah, I also think anti-fascism is just one tactic, for the left, and there are plenty of critiques on the left of anti-fascism, that it is too reactive, that it's essentially passive, in that it is a response to far-right organizing. And, far from these apocalyptic fears that Antifa is going to come to your house and burn down your town or whatever, the truth is that as fascism rises, anti-fascism rises, and as fascism wanes, anti-fascism wanes. It really is responsive to far-right organizing, whereas other forms of leftist organizing seek to shift the world in other ways. And so I think they're complementary.
Thank you. Next question from the audience. Did you encounter any sense of doubt versus utter certainty or curiosity in the people within these hate groups? And I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I think what I understand it as, and I'll kind of twist it a little bit. I sensed, when you talked about it in the passage you read, that you did sense humanity in these individuals, and that many of them could be someone you just passed on the street. And so can you talk a little bit about, for me, what I'm curious is, how many of these people do you think are savable souls? How many of them do you think are victims of trauma or some issues? And if they were reached, they could be, taught that this is not okay, that it's not acceptable, versus how many do you think there is just, these are people who are never coming back? And I don't like to use the word lost souls, but these are people who are just never going to see any other belief than.
I think I tend to think a little less metaphysically about it. I think, the spaces that I was observing and or infiltrating were spaces of bravado and machismo, places where people hyped each other up, and it was all about like who can be more extreme, who can be more vile. And so there wasn't a lot of doubt expressed there. But when I say that like these people are human and it's precisely their humanity that damns them, right? What I mean is like this is the result of a series of choices, and certainly people can leave the here certainly people do wind up leaving the movement, and there are some great people. There's a woman named Shannon Martinez who's a former white supremacist herself, and helps other people leave the movement, especially because these are violent folks. It's sort of not so easy to leave. It's like leaving an abuser in a way, and people's identities are really bound up in it. I think something that, and this I think will address another audience question. Like people really get bound up in the story that white nationalist movement tells people. People feel, I think all of us have moments where we feel lonely, confused, lost, purposeless, like unsure of our place in the world and how to find meaning in it. And the white power movement has answers. You're going to be a warrior for the white race. You're fighting against this existential threat. You are fighting this incredibly powerful, infinitely resourced, infinitely malevolent Jewish enemy. You're fighting for the future, for children, white children and all that. So, part of fighting that radicalization is being able to conquer the story and tell a better one. I think that the idea that like every white power movementarian person is the victim of sort of unspeakable trauma or deep socioeconomic marginalization or completely socially stunted, like I think that's a bit of a pernicious myth in a way, and like a sort of a self-excusing myth for a lot of folks who are white. It's this idea of like it couldn't be anyone in my town or anyone in my school, it couldn't be anyone I know. It's this toothless Cletus in his mother's basement, redneck, and also that like it's understandable in a way that he turned to this hate because his life was so stunted otherwise. Whereas like in my experience, there are very much people from every socioeconomic background and every level of educational attainment and every zip code. Certainly there are folks in San Mateo County who share these beliefs, just as there are in Kings County, where Brooklyn is located. There really isn't a space or a place or a neighborhood that insulates you from this kind of story that draws you in. The question of de-radicalization is a big and thorny one, and there are lots of people who are addressing it with more nuance than I do. But I just like, there are two stories that always come to mind when I think about de-radicalization. So one is the story of Megan Phelps Roper, who was a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, grew up in that family, and eventually wound up being de-radicalized because she ran the Westboro Baptist Church Twitter account and like had her own, and wound up DMing with a guy who sort of very slowly, very gently pushed against the hateful beliefs that she had been inculcated in and grown up with. And they wound up married. I mean, that's the level of emotional, intimacy it takes. That's the level of intense engagement it takes, and then there's also the story of Derek Black. So, book lovers, Eli Saslow, a fellow journalist, wrote a great book called Rising Out of Hatred about Derek Black's story. He is the son of John Black, who's the founder of Stormfront, the original and still biggest neo-Nazi website that's like linked to over 100 murders. And, the godson of David Duke, really groomed to be the heir to the white supremacist throne. And he wound up attending a small liberal arts university in Florida. He was outed by fellow students as hosting this white nationalist radio show, and subsequently was invited and went every week for years and years and years to a Shabbat dinner hosted by Jewish fellow students. And, it was a mixed race group of people that attended. So first of all, he had to be ready to accept that invitation. And the people who were inviting him had to be ready to invite him into the space and share that space with an avowed white supremacist. And it took years to take him out of those beliefs. So it really is a very intense and intimate process to de-radicalize people. And the people who do it are wonderful and valiant, but it's not for everyone. And it's not necessarily scalable in a big sort of swift way. So I think the quicker and easier, and maybe or maybe not easier, but the quicker route, the more scalable route, is to make it just like socially unacceptable and worthy of pariahdom to express this kind of bigotry. And that's sort of the more Antifa take on things.
Well, it sounds like the folks who do that work are also incredibly patient. I don't know that I'd have the patience for it. But you're absolutely right. And what we also know for certain now is that if we as a society let it be normed, if we let government norm it, it rises. There is no doubt about that whatsoever in my mind. Second to last question, might be the last one, depending on how long he's been answering, because it's a meaty one. You referred in one of your chapters to the Silicon Six, describing the CEOs of 6 Silicon Valley companies that facilitate and do not intervene in providing a forum for these hate groups in the name of profit. Then the question, which is a meaty one, which I think this country struggles with mightily. In a liberal democracy, arguably, in which we live, how do we preserve freedom of expression at the expense of censorship? I'm very curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that goes back to like Malthus and Hobbes and all kinds of much smarter philosophers than me. But I'd say this: I think there's a lot of panic about free speech people have, and it always winds up being about preserving the free speech of Nazis and hate mongers and propagandists and people who, encourage harassment campaigns and inflict real pain on lots of different other people who are their targets. Whereas a question for me is like, how much speech is suppressed by people who wind up staying silent about their own beliefs because they don't want to face barrages of hate or death threats or rape threats? Like, I've just personally faced like pretty intense opposition and threats against my family. And I've decided that that's something I'm willing to live with. But should that be the price that every Jew, every woman of color, every Muslim, every trans person has to pay just to speak out publicly? And isn't that a threat to free speech too? I think we get so stuck on the idea that you should be able to wave a swastika flag in public that we forget about, who winds up not leaving their home because of those threats. And I think the question, you're talking about liberal democracy as if this is, government censorship that we're talking about. I think there's a great element where we as a society have the power to determine what are the acceptable parameters of speech. You know, what will cause us to lash out against someone and let them know that that's not acceptable. And I think that we have to exercise that power a lot more vigorously, like let people know being a Nazi is not an okay thing to be, like get out of town. I'm not afraid of a slippery slope from that. Let's address the people calling for genocide first. You know, and of course, I think these Silicon Valley companies have an inordinate amount of power over speech. And I think that they exercise it very poorly. I think if they cared about content moderation, if they cared about making sure that like their trans and queer and Muslim and Jewish, you know, users were safe, they would take content moderation a lot more seriously than they do. But like, again, I'm like, once we've addressed the people calling for open genocide and murder of people who look and believe like me, and you know, anyone who isn't white, like then we can talk about a slippery slope. We have a giant problem metastasizing, and I think, you know, far too many people are like so excited to self-congratulate at the idea of being the bastions of liberal democracy that they forget the very, very real collateral damage that's done by allowing these viewpoints to be aired.
Yeah, and I'll note that despite an emotional experience that you had writing this book, despite having heard horrible things from truly horrible people, I haven't heard you say we should kill them, and yet some of them want to kill you. And I think
No,
the point is
I'm
well
not a
taken.
murderer at heart. I just think that, you know, they should be maybe not so eager to show their faces in public, and not so excited to spread propaganda, and not able to do it so freely and with the cooperation of, you know, everyone from social media companies to payment processors to internet service providers. Like, I think lots of choices are made when hate is facilitated. And I think it's the anti-fascist task to try to stop and counter every step.
There's a difference between tolerance for viewpoints and tolerance for other human beings. When someone doesn't have tolerance for other human beings, we've got a bigger problem. All right, final question. How can ordinary people, I don't even know what that means, who are horrified by what you found, which I think is most of us, take concrete action to bring these hate groups down, or at least break them apart so they have less power, influence, and reach? I think you talked a little bit about this earlier, and I'll also add on to it using your own language. How do we, you know, at least tamp them down and get their heads back down so they're not so comfortable shouting publicly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, you know, I talk a bit about this in the book and in the chapter We Keep Us Safe. But I think the answer starts in San Mateo County with you guys, right? Like, you look around, you see like who are the people making racist comments in your neighborhood next door, your neighborhood Facebook group. You shut them down where it happens. You shut them down in your family. You have more power than you think you do. You know, take that horror, take that desire to fight, and look up your local Proud Boys chapter. You know, like dive in. Try to keep yourself safe. Like, use a VPN, and you know, if you're making a persona, like don't use your real phone number or real email. But like, if you, in the words of like my friend Molly Conger, who's a wonderful anti-fascist activist, um, you know, if you've stayed up all night looking at your ex's Instagram and figured out who they're dating now, you have all the skills it takes to find your local Nazi. So start in San Mateo County, start in Belmont, start, you know, in your town, figure out, you know, who are the people that are seeking to terrorize your neighbors. You have that power, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to do it and make racism and bigotry less welcome, less comfortable, and less confident in its dominance and in our hearts and in our society.
Hear, hear. Talia, thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Thank you for doing this work, Talia, and putting yourself in personal jeopardy to do it. It's appreciated by many people, believe me, and we need to shine a bright light on this. For the folks here today or watching this later after it's archived, if you enjoyed this author event, please check out our future author events at smcl.org/events. And we would also appreciate it if you could tell us what you thought about this event at smcl.org/rate this event. And with that, Talia, again, thank you very much. And I wish everyone a good and safe evening.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.